Our second lecture this afternoon is to be presented by Don Walker, and it's called The Great Green Desert. Don Walker. Does it work? Yeah, I think it's better if we do it. Try it.
No, I don't have a red T-shirt. Sorry. My interest as a designer is in the study of the organization of natural patterns. Can you hear okay? I think so. And even human patterns, because I feel that we should find which ones are determinants, which ones provide opportunities, and which ones are inspiration or can be inspiration for our design schemes. The patterns of microclimate and surface configuration and all that you've heard of before. But at the risk of being labeled a plantsman, this afternoon I'd like to talk about plants, because plants happen to be the most varied and the most delightful and the most indispensable element in our landscape, because after all, plants make the earth habitable. Before I start to tell you what I want to tell you, I'll first tell you what I'm not going to tell you about, and if you'd put it on the slides, I'd find out which one of these works. That one. Okay. Put the lights out. I'm not going to talk about plants as producers of oxygen or as food. These are the elephants that are eating, the Ringling Brothers elephants that are eating the hedge. I'm not going to talk about plants as they produce wood or fiber, or as they ameliorate wind. This is in Russia, supposedly. Or as they screen out undesirable views. This is... Or anything that is known as street trees. Or garden walls, or garden floors, or garden ceilings. I don't want to talk about architectural decoration. Joe did enough of that. Don't want to talk about horticultural specimens either. That's in Boston. And I don't want to talk about those rare museum pieces. That's my van. What I will try to do is to show you some of the range of plant societies or communities and their habitats, some of the range of the destructive influences on these societies, the Great Green Desert, the regenerative qualities of plant societies, and a few examples of man and plant communities living in harmony, which I think maybe should best be described as where man has decided to become a part of the plant community. Very briefly, there are plants that live in water, or that live in fluctuating water, in this case salt. It's a salt marsh. There are plants that live in alkali ponds, plants that live in cold glacial outwash ponds. There are plants that can grow after a forest fire. And there are plants that withstand cold, deep snow, and the blasting of ice particles in strong wind. In fact, there are plants that have developed over the millennia that fit just about every habitat there is where there's moisture on the surface of this earth. You see some that are growing in the gravel, some that are in the moist places next to the soil, next to the bare places that are eroded by the moving stream. On the hillsides, you see a few plants, mostly in the valleys where it's moist. These are south and southwest slopes. If you looked at those hills from the east, and especially from the north, there'd be a lot more green showing. This is just east of the Rocky Mountains, where the moisture from the mountains begins to lessen in the distance, become the Great Plains. So one of the things that these communities of plants indicate is the combination of all the habitat factors. And if you knew plants well enough, you could read any of these landscapes. This is one of the high deserts, cold deserts. Plants that grow in sand dunes that stabilize the dunes and allow other things to grow. And here plants that are sculpted but can withstand the salt spray from the ocean. If we come into our own region, we'll find quite a number, not maybe with such great variety as the pictures I've just shown, but a number of different habitat situations, each of which has its own cast of plant actors. This is a swamp, happens to be in southern Illinois. Many of my pictures in southern Illinois. Some are from Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin. These that follow. The swamp is an area of shallow water where the water remains constantly. There's always water here. Cypress swamp, however, fluctuates. There are some times when the water will be there for years at a time, but occasionally it dries up and provides a seedbed for plants to grow on. The edges of lakes and ponds, even man-made ones, there are certain plants that can grow in the water, and as a result of their growth, the ponds slowly fill in. Now here is a pond or a reservoir where the water has been lowered, and you can see that the plants to the right follow along a contour which is approximately 3 feet below the normal water line. Beyond that, plants won't grow, at least these kinds of plants. Along most of our streams in the Midwest, there are so-called floodplains. They've been developed by the streams, and they are occupied by plants that can withstand flooding for a few weeks of the year. If someone dams up these streams and holds the water for longer periods of time, all of these plants will die because they're not adapted to long periods of inundation. These same plants, since they are in the floodplain and the floodplain is being built up, can also withstand a certain amount of root burial. The soil usually is very sandy, and so they can withstand burial by water for short periods and burial by small amounts annually of additional soil over their roots without any problems. Out in the stream, on sandbars, there are certain plants that can withstand not only the annual flooding, but then when the water goes down, it's a pretty dry site. And so there are these plants, they also take a great buffeting by the floodwaters when they're going downstream. Streamside vegetation varies depending on the soil, on the location, the altitude, the amount of fluctuation in the stream over the year. So these three streams have different kinds of plants because they have different kinds of conditions along the streams. None of these flood, well, the first one floods some, the second two flood very little. But the boundaries of the streams, the soil is always moist. If you get back from the stream, here these are all maples, but the maples that are still green are down along in the floodplain, and the maples with the yellow leaves are sugar maples. So there's a silver maple, the sugar maples. They're in higher, better dried, better drained land. So you get this kind of a woodland in the fall. And these same kinds of patterns, only in much smaller scale on the ground, indicate even more subtle variations in the habitat or in all of the microenvironment conditions. So that from place to place, from woodland to woodland, from season to season, these ground patterns change. This is in a floodplain. This is a higher, drier land. As the season changes, especially in deciduous forests, what happens is the ground flora has to put on its yearly growth early in the spring before they're completely shaded out by the leaves of the trees. And then again in the fall, when the leaves begin to fall off the trees, the light comes back onto the ground, and then there's another series of plants that do most of their growth at that time. This is a very moist situation at the bottom in a ravine, and it changes during the year in the way it looks. And finally, in the winter, we have a deciduous forest, which people who come from other parts of the world apparently don't take to right off. Besides forests, there are a number of other plant communities. And this is a bog. Bog is wet. There's water underneath much of this, and it's just very acidic. So there are a whole series of plants that grow here that grow in none of those other places. In fact, in many of those other pictures, the plants in any one of those pictures the plants are entirely different from the plants in any of the other pictures. Acidic, moist, shady, low nitrogen. And if you look at any landscape, it's a combination of several different societies or communities, and they're known as a mosaic of different plant associations, communities, societies, whatever you want to call it. Each one very specifically adapted to its habitat at this particular time. If somebody cut some of those trees down, a different association would grow there, at least initially. Here you can see this sycamores down along the stream and the oaks up on the hillside behind them. The cedars on the tops of these very dry cliffs. Cedars are junipers. And the cedars, junipers on the side. And another $7.5 billion a year in equipment. Okay? But that's not all bad. These are people who are planting plants. And they're making our earth green, but they're not. What they're doing is they're preventing all of those other things from happening that would otherwise occur on these sites. And it's costing at least $15 billion a year to do that. And what are you doing, especially at home? Okay. Here's a lawn care program from the Co-op Extension Service in Purdue in 1971. It says, quote, "A dense, uniform turf is your aim," unquote. And so the kinds of things you should do from March until November are fertilize, mow, overseed, kill weeds, irrigate, manicure, prevent crabgrass, control insects, roll it, control grubs and moles, control sod webworm, prevent disease, control wild onion, dethatch, and rake leaves. And some of those controlling things that you might use are 2,4-D, dicamba, betasan, balan, azac, terposan, Dacthal, Bandane, Chlordane, turf fungicide, dieldrin, aldrin, Balox, Dilox, Spectricide, 2 or 3 treatments of organic arsenicals, DSMA or AMA, Malathion, Lindane, Dithane, Carathane, and I'm sure they've figured out more since then, because a number of these have since been ruled unusable by the USDA because of their toxic qualities. Okay? So besides being wasteful of energy, think of all the gas and oil to manufacture all those herbicides and pesticides, in addition to all the lawnmowers. They're wasteful of energy, and they're also dangerous to our health. So what's an alternative? What happens? One way to find out what to do in a landscape, whenever you're designing in a landscape, especially when people say they're interested in low maintenance, what will happen if we don't do anything? That's one extreme. Well, I forgot to mention, this of course is the ultimate, right? That is to take the grass off of not only our play fields, but all our fields, all our areas, and put plastic down. We did see that occur in Cincinnati on our field trip, but I don't have a picture of that. And maybe it's cheaper and, whoops, where'd that come from? Is that the next tray?
There's one other tray go yet.
No, let's see. There's a mistake there. Let's check. Okay. Well, what happens when you do nothing is there are various activities that plants are involved in, which all put together are known as plant succession. And in a bog like this, you can see concentric circles. There's water in the middle, then there are lilies, then there are floating plants, then there are some shrubs, then there are trees, etc. And what's happening is the plants, the result of their plants being there, is building up the soil on the bottom of the bog, and the soil gets shallower, different plants can grow. Finally, there's no water left. The water gets shallower. And finally, there's no water there at all, and it's dry land. So this is a way to get from wet to dry. Same thing happens on the edges of any water body if it's still enough that the result of the plants being there means that the ground begins to build up and it gets drier. Plants that grow in wet areas are hydric plants, and ones that grow on the area, less wet areas, moist areas, are mesic. So what happens is plant succession always goes from hydric to mesic. Willows and things growing in wet areas. Then you have very dry areas, like bare rock, which begin to get some moss, little plants, leaves collect, ultimately soil builds up, and cedars, oaks, etc. grow. It's becoming more moist from dry, so plants go from wet to mesic, from dry to mesic, whenever possible. And this is a road cut. These are big blue stem that's come in because it hasn't been mowed lately. Another road cut, you begin to see patterns, really nice patterns that occur, regeneration patterns that partly are random and partly reflect the quality of the site. These patterns may be here because of depth to water table, to depth to bedrock, because there may have been a fire through here at one time, there may have been roads, compaction, tree cutting, whatever. The patterns begin to come out of the landscape. These are patterns of plants in the little crevices on lava bed. And even in somebody's front lawn, green desert, if they'll let it go, the psylla, which have regenerating all over the place. This is a sand and gravel pit, and what happens when they're done is there's nothing but this waste sand. They sell the gravel and there's a lot of extra sand. You can see all the plants that are beginning to come along the edge. All the plants on the other side have come up by themselves. Took a little longer than a few years. And these are all pictures in that gravel pit. These trees and other plants regenerated naturally through succession. Same place. How about a strip mine? That's pretty drastic, where you take all the soil from 100 feet down and throw it on top, which is the way this particular one worked. You go back a few years later, and there are a few plants, and each year there'll be more. Until the entire surface is clothed in plants again. It may take a long time, depending on how toxic it is, how steep it is, how dry it is. But you always find the mosaic. Where it's wet, you find plants that only grow in wet places, like these grasses in the near foreground, and the cedars, which only grow in dry places. And you go back many years later, and they're still the same plants in approximately the same places, only bigger. An old field, these occur across the whole of the country, from Mississippi at least, and probably in the Ozarks as well, to the Carolinas. Fields have been abandoned because the soil wasn't very good to farm in the first place. They used to be forest, everything was burnt off. It was plowed probably up and down hill, soil all eroded away, couldn't make any money on it, farmer left. And plants begin to come back. Broom sedge, some pines, some cedars. A few years, there are others, including the sassafras, and the spaces are beginning to close in. And ultimately, it will be a forest, a deciduous forest again. If you look along our green desert, if you look right along the edge of the sidewalk, you'll see thousands of maple seedlings. They won't last past the first mowing, but they're trying. Or look in the park, with its stumps over there on the right, and all these little yellowish green spots are thousands of maple seedlings. They try every year, and nobody lets them. Or look under the hedge, and you see 100 little redbud trees, and they all get pruned off. Here's a rose bed. It's all prickly, and so it doesn't get weeded. And here are a bunch of different kinds of trees that are growing up in it. Or the yucca, or the iris, with all the maples coming up. Here's an abandoned house with sumac growing all around it. Or a house in the city which is either abandoned or is being rented by students and the landlord doesn't care. Actually, it's probably much warmer and much cooler than the house next door, because it's being protected both from the sun and from the wind by the plants that have come up all around the foundation. And if you leave it long enough, it'll be one of those lovely pictures that Joe's office spent thousands of dollars to enhance. This is a green desert which the owner decided to leave alone and let it become forest. And so it didn't mow the grass at all until the city came to complain that there was an ordinance and you had to mow. By that time, a number of little things had come up, so the mowing went around those things. And the next year, the same thing occurred. Didn't mow it until they were required to mow it. And in a couple of years, it's beginning to get somewhat woodsy. Nothing was planted. That's the house back looking the other direction now. And it's 3 years. Here is Bob Zalomi's front yard in Urbana. He had one sumac plant that was growing next to his house, and he kept mowing and mowing his yard. And one day when I was there, I said, hey, look, you know, you got all these little sumacs coming up that you keep mowing off. And so he decided, well, he wouldn't mow about 5 feet away from it and see what happened. And the next year he didn't mow another 5 feet. And the next year he just went right out to the property line. He doesn't mow it at all. So in about 3 years, he's got a sumac forest. This is Dick Williams' house. He's an architect in Champaign. And he's more controlling, as architects are. He lets some trees come up, but he doesn't let everything come up. And so several times a year, he has gravel. Everything is gravel. Several times a year, he walks around on that terrace with a blowtorch and burns off everything that he doesn't want to come up. That's a dark glass clear story in his studio on the second floor, which reflects all the plants. This was a rerouting of a stream in a park, and sort of this is at the end of the first year, hoping that the park district would allow the native plants to return. I went along and I pulled out the ragweed so that there couldn't be any complaints about that. But I think it's probably a pretty chancy thing as to whether the park district mowers can stay away from that area. This was in another park, a very badly eroded slope. Actually, it used to be a river bank, and the park is down there. It's a road. And people would walk up and down, kids would bicycle up and down. It was very badly eroded, and they were going to spend thousands and thousands of dollars planting Vinca minor in this white subsoil. And I suggested before they do that, maybe they ought to just try a play spot and do nothing. And they've done that in this particular area for 3 years. Here someone not only let things grow, but planted some particular things they wanted. This is another green desert transformed. This was the first year. And this was sent to me by one of my ex-students whose parents moved to Georgia. See all these people trying to establish green desert in the red Georgia soil. And he went down there and he tried to help his parents do that for a while and decided that it was hopeless. Instead decided to help return it to what it was before, which was a pine forest with pine needles covering the entire ground surface. And so he went off and collected all the pine needles that everybody else wanted to get rid of and spread them in places around his parents. And in 2 years, this particular part of it looked like that, which is sort of jungly, but it needs a little more time. Ultimately, all forests have very little ground story. They have trunks and shade above, and you can see through it and walk through it very easily. Then there are people who try very carefully not to disturb what was there before. And so here's a new house set into an old landscape, which was the result of an old house being there, which was destroyed. And the old apple tree, the old foundation planting, which is now tall evergreens. Here's a house in near Portland, Oregon. Just has little pathways running through around it. And this is Burnham Woods, a condominium development outside of Minneapolis, and one of the finest I've seen in this country, where bands of the forest were left and bands of condominium and small lawns were put in between. This is a Jonathan Newtown, which I don't recommend particularly. In fact, this was the finest thing in the whole town, which was to go from one level to another without any grading or a minimum amount of plant community destruction. And here is at least a little bit of the original community left at a high school site outside of Chicago. And this is Four Lakes in Lisle, Illinois, which was built around some old gravel pits. The original section was designed by Alfred Caldwell, one of Jens Jensen's apprentices, and saved all the existing plants, and the plants that he added were of the same species. And unlike one of the slides I couldn't find, which was in the desert in Oregon, from a distance you see this green spot. It's a rest area with sprinkler systems which must be running constantly all day. In Idaho, the rest stops, which is set into the landscape and had little information booths that told you what it was. This is part of the lava flow. In Denmark, they use natural landscapes in many ways. This is a heath with a sculptured garden. These are apartments or houses around a pond and marsh. If this was in the United States, that marsh would now no longer exist. It would be dredged out and with or without polyethylene. This you can't see very well. It's in Sweden, so I show another picture to explain what's actually happening here. Something like this. This is a working forest, and they harvest the big trees occasionally, but they allow regeneration, little trees at different places and at different heights. And that little strip, which is 50 feet wide in front of those apartment buildings, it's 50 feet of plants and then about 200 feet of roadway and parking lot, and then the apartment building in Stockholm, where certain amounts, at least, of the original kinds of vegetation were replanted, because this was very much like our own riverbanks in the 30s, and this was a park project. And here in Denmark, it may look like Great Green Desert to you, and it is in part, but around the edges of this corner and that corner over there, certain parts of this park are fenced off and are not mown for about 15 or 20 years, and let everything grow. And then when the trees get to a fair size in there, they select some to save, they remove the rest, put grass underneath, and fence off a different portion of the park so that it's constantly regenerating by itself. And the good part about that is that only those plants that will grow well there ever grow there, instead of somebody bringing in Norway spruces and white birches and things like that from some other part of the world. Here's an attempt to reestablish a prairie around a insurance building. There's an article on this in one of the latest issues of Landscape Quarterly. And here, in fact, is a prairie reestablished in downtown Madison, Wisconsin, a very small site. I end up with this one place. This is at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. It is all, I'll show you pictures of only a select portion of the university. It is not all like this. Most of the university grounds are, in fact, Great Green Desert and parking lot, but a fairly good portion of it, starting here on our left, is not. If you go into the Union at Southern Illinois University and you look out the window in the back, you will see this Thompson's Woods. You go out on the terrace and you're next to Thompson's Woods. You can walk off of the terrace and through Thompson's Woods. The campus is wrapped around Thompson's Woods, part of it at least. There are light fixtures, like this green one right in the foreground. There's this little culvert bridge for drainage, and most of the ground cover is poison ivy. In fact, some of the plants that they plant on the buildings, because they say it's their best vine, is poison ivy. You can walk through these various pathways down to Thompson's Lake. And if you're a student, you can check out a canoe or a fishing rod and fish at Thompson's Lake. And there are other places where there were no woods before, as here, where they plant some plants and then leave them alone. Like that. So I have a few things to suggest to you in closing as environmental designers. One thing you might do is, whenever possible, choose to develop the worst sites. If you develop, in whatever way, the worst sites, then our overall environment will be improved. If you always choose the best sites, no matter what you do, probably part of it will become paved, part of it will become green desert, and overall our environment will deteriorate because nobody's paying any attention to the worst sites. So that's one thing you might do. And the other thing you might do next spring when the grass starts to grow is you might not mow it at all. You might not mow it as often. Or you might not mow all of it. And you might be surprised at what comes up. Thank you.